unlike what we saw in the anime. There was quite a bit more to the initial fight between Elsa and Garfiel. Elsa was a lot more tactical when it came to how she approached her opponent, and because of this it forced Garfiel to have to rely on a partial transformation. Not only that, but there was also a whole nother level of planning from Subaru and the others that we weren't even made aware of. So let's take a look at all that and more as we go through the first half of cut content for episode 47. But first, this video is sponsored by SURFSHARK. By using surfshark.deal/AniNews, you can get 83% off a 2-year plan plus an additional 3 free months. It's what I've personally been using to watch Mushoku Tensei for free over at the Muse Asia YouTube channel. By simply switching over to a server in Singapore, a whole collection of new anime titles become instantly available all on YouTube. So it's definitely worth using even if only just for that. If you're looking for something more though, there's numerous other features like a camouflage mode that hides your usage from your internet provider, or even a no borders mode which allows you to unblock normally restricted websites and apps from anywhere in the world, all of which can be used on an unlimited number of devices all at the same time. So if you're interested in starting this more secure and versatile online experience, or even just want to gain access to more seasonal anime, then go ahead and use the link in the description to check out surfshark.deal/AniNews today. Now, let's get back to the video. Episode 47 Part 1, The Final Day of Roswell Manor, covering Chapter 1 of Volume 15 of the light novel. Before we get started with Garfiel's fight with Elsa, there was first a cutscene on the way to the mansion that went to show how Subaru and the others were planning their approach. It was a whole debrief of what to do and what to expect once they got there. The first topic was the inevitable reunion of Frederica and Garfiel. As we find out, it had been 10 years since the two last saw each other, and because Garfiel was too busy resenting Frederica for abandoning him, not once did he ever read any of the letters that she'd sent to him. Of course, now he knew that she was only trying to make a place for him. So it was for that reason that Subaru knew their reunion was sure to be a touching one. That being the case, he also felt the need to stress that time was limited. He needed Garfiel to know that there wasn't going to be much of an opportunity to make up with each other. Reason being that Petra and Rem required near immediate assistance. Their inability to fight back made it almost certain they would die unless someone came to help them. So if that person was going to be Garfiel, then Subaru wanted to make sure he was in the right state of mind and body to do it. One thing to note is that Garfiel's body still wasn't fully recovered from what had happened earlier. Yes, Amelia did use her healing magic to fix any physical injuries, but that didn't help to recover any of the blood, mana, or stamina he'd lost. It forced Garfiel to have to rely on his blessing of the Earth Spirit. If he was able to make use of that, then his body would be fully restored by the time he got to the mansion. The only issue was that in order for the blessing to take effect, his feet needed to be making contact with the ground, something that wasn't possible if he was sitting in the carriage. So what Garfiel did was, rather than sit in the wagon all the way to Sanctuary, he instead ran alongside it so his feet were touching the ground all the way there. Of course, he was holding on to the windowsill so as to not use too much energy, but just the sight of seeing him be dragged along was sure to make any bystanders think that he was trying to force his way in. It also didn't help that this was getting close to triggering Subaru's PTSD. As much as he knew it was impossible, Subaru couldn't help but imagine Garfiel getting dragged into the wheel much like how Juice did. But that was likely to be more damaging to the carriage than it was to him. Anyway, with Garfiel's job now established, Otto was next to receive his, and he was put in charge of evacuating the villagers. You see, Subaru knew that even if they weren't the targets for assassination, Elsa and Meili certainly weren't beyond killing them. So while Subaru would be focused with getting Beatrice, Otto would take Petra to the village and start clearing out the people there, thus giving everyone an idea of what they needed to do. Moving on to the start of Garfiel's fight with Elsa. Immediately after she stepped in to interrupt the sibling reunion, she also threw one of her knives straight towards Garfiel. It was an attack that definitely would have split the head of any normal person, but because this was Garfiel, he knew that this was something that he could easily block against. So he decided the best course of action was to deflect it into the ceiling so that Elsa wouldn't be able to use it anymore. As she pulled out a spare to replace the one she'd lost, Elsa charged towards Garfiel in a posture that indicated she was going for his ankles. That much was obvious just by looking at her. But this was actually nothing more than a tactical diversion. You see, the knife Elsa had thrown earlier actually had a string tied to it, allowing her to yank it from the ceiling and catch Garfiel in a pincer attack of blades from both sides. The instant Frederica yelled to warn him it was coming, Garfiel had already transformed his arm into its larger beast version. He then swung it with so much speed and force that even Elsa was caught off guard by it. It was a moment of hesitation that gave Garfiel the opportunity to dodge the knife coming from behind him. He was also able to shift his body in a way that positioned himself to counter Elsa. So the end result was a block of Elsa's attack with a heavy swing of his shield. A parry strong enough to send her flying backwards and deal damage on impact. As Frederica watched her brother fight so capably, she couldn't help but start to admire just how strong he'd become. It was clear that he'd spent the last 10 years working hard to do so, a realization that was starting to move her. That said, she wasn't the only one who now held Garfiel's combat ability in fairly high regard. The assassin he'd just flung like a ragdoll found herself in appreciation of it as well. His recent display of power was something she too couldn't help but compliment. The fact she was even standing after what she'd just been hit by, though, was really more like a testament to her own power. So this was what led Garfield to the conclusion that he needed to fight her alone. When Frederica insisted that she stay and help, it wasn't just Garfield that told her that she'd just be in the way. Even Elsa said a few words that went to imply her presence would be more of a hindrance than a benefit. It was a point made painfully clear just by watching the two continue to fight each other. What she saw was a seamless flow of movement similar to that of a dance. A constant exchange of dodges and blocks that left Frederica zero opportunity to interfere. The only thing she could do was stand back and watch, as anything else required an immense buildup of courage. Now, once Garfield had caught the knife with his mouth like how we saw in the anime, he actually made sure to shatter it with his teeth before letting it go, this time ensuring Elsa wouldn't be able to get it back like how she did before. This gave Garfield the advantage since Elsa now needed to create space to rebalance herself. But it was as she was in the process of doing that Garfield managed to grab her braid and give her face the Helsing treatment. What the anime didn't show here, though, was that Garfield believed the battle was as good as finished now. His thoughts raced as he believed the only thing left to do was snap her neck, cave in her skull, and grind her face against the wall until there was nothing left. A great plan in concept for sure. But by allowing his mind to wander away from the battle, it gave Elsa an opening to attack that Garfield was only able to dodge out of sheer instinct. She then followed it up with a flurry of slices, all while they were falling to the floor below. Had it not been for his intuition, then Garfield would have lost the fight right there. But by using his shield and beast-like instincts, he was able to parry most of the attacks and keep the damage to a minimum. Now, it wasn't entirely necessary for Garfield to continue engaging in combat right now. He'd already accomplished his primary objective of sending Frederica to get Rem. The problem was that he couldn't remember what his other objectives were. Yes, one of them did entail defeating Elsa, but there was also a backup plan for just in case he couldn't, one that he couldn't seem to remember. So, to Garfield, the only reasonable approach now was to defeat Elsa himself. That way there wouldn't even be a need for a backup plan. Now, while all that was happening, Subaru was doing his part to make things easier for Garfield. You see, the main reason he was trying to get everyone out of the mansion was so that Garfield could use his full power. He was sure that Garfield's superhuman strength would be on par with Elsa's. His main concern, though, was that Garfield's kind-heartedness would get the best of him. I mean, this was after all how Subaru had beat him. If Garfield held back out of concern for his allies getting in the crossfire, then the odds of him beating Elsa would be significantly less. So Subaru was here to make sure that that wasn't a problem. Since Petra and Rem had already been taken care of, that meant the only remaining obstacle was Beatrice. But the instant she gets clear from the mansion, that's when Garfield won't have to hold back anymore, putting him in peak condition to face off against Elsa. The hardest thing about dealing with Beatrice, though, was that she was even worse than Roswaal when it came to the book. At least Roswaal knew what he was doing, but Beatrice didn't seem to have the faintest idea. So the more she denied his help, the angrier he became, leading Subaru to realize that the past few loops had been a constant battle against his wrath. It was an anger that was always being shifted from one place to the next, starting with himself in the trials, then shifting to the witches who played him, moving to Garfield after what he'd done, then veering towards Roswaal for being too stubborn to change, finally ending up at Amelia, who refused to accept herself or the love of those around her. While that was the last time that Subaru had felt this way, it was here in this moment that he now found himself angry at fate itself. He hated how the very concept was the reason for Beatrice's suffering. So he began to express that anger in a raging condemnation of the way she'd spent the past 400 years, eventually getting to the point of throwing doubts at Echidna. The instant he implied that she could have made a mistake, Beatrice responded by asking if he would ever doubt his own mother. It was a question to which Subaru immediately responded with yes. You see, there was a time back when Subaru was younger when his mother told him that a satellite was falling. While there was in fact a satellite plummeting to Earth, the information his mom told him was that it was falling into their prefecture. But the truth was that it was simply falling into the atmosphere. So when Subaru went back to school and told all his classmates how a satellite was going to hit the area, they all began to mock him for being so stupid. To make things worse, his mom didn't even remember that she'd made that mistake. So it was ever since then that Subaru refused to blindly believe anything his parents ever told him. Now, even after giving that whole story, Subaru still went on to recall all the arguments that ended with him and his dad in a fistfight. They were memories he felt would get Beatrice to better understand that doubting others was normal. But that was an idea that she simply couldn't comprehend. When Subaru finally got her to the point of asking him to be that person, there was a bit more explanation for the reasoning behind his unexpected response. Yes, this question was directly linked to bringing an end to Beatrice's emptiness, but the approach she was taking to answering it wasn't the right one. It wasn't Subaru's job to tell her that he was that person. No, the whole purpose of the experiment was for her to choose. Since there wasn't any right answer to who that person was, Subaru could only surmise that Echidna wanted to see if Beatrice would be able to choose on her own. It was a single question that ended up leading her straight into 400 years of loneliness. So if Subaru was to come and say that he was that person, well, that would just end up making all that time meaningless. For Beatrice to truly break free from the shackles of fate, then she would need to make the decision all by herself. Choosing who that person was something only she could do. That's why Subaru ended up responding the way he did. Now, after he'd been ejected from the library and flung into the gardens, Subaru had a bit more to say to Meili. He was trying to convince her to look the other way. Seeing as how her schedule and plans had been completely ruined, Subaru attempted to get her to think that the best course of action was to simply retreat. It was obvious though that a crude reason like that wasn't enough to sway her. The fact that he could sense more demon beasts approaching from the yard was more than enough to prove that. So, after Subaru and the others had run into the mansion to escape her, Subaru decided to ask Otto if he could use his blessing of language to negotiate with the beasts. Surprisingly, his ability actually works on them. But unfortunately, any conversation with them usually amounts to the demon beast just talking about how they're going to eat him. So it really wasn't much of a conversation at all. That said, the repel stone they had would keep them safe from all other beasts except for one. It just so happened that the one beast immune to it was the one they'd come across, bringing us to the end of the parts in the mansion and the first half of the episode. As I'm sure you've noticed by now, it seems that ReZero has decided to skim on most of the fights in order to make room for the story. Which, if you ask me, I honestly don't mind if it means the plot gets portrayed in the best way possible. Sure, it is a bit unfortunate to lose some of the more intense action scenes, but I'd much rather have a coherent story than one with only lots of action. Anyway, the next half of the episode will be out tomorrow, so be sure to come back then to see more about Amelia's unknowable present. Now, before I go, I'd like to thank SURFSHARK once again for sponsoring this video. Don't forget, you can use the link in the description to check out surfshark.deal/AniNews and get 83% off that 2-year plan today. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!